Welcome to ¿Qué pasa? HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic Serving Institutions. I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness.
Saludos HSI familia, and welcome back to ¿Qué pasa HSIs? On today's episode, we are going to talk about what it means to be an historic HSI, or what I like to call a TIA HSI. Historic HSIs are those institutions that were enrolling 25% Latine students in 1992 when the Higher Education Act was reauthorized to include HSIs. Those historic HSIs are spread out across Texas, New Mexico, and California, where the college-going population was already changing in the early 1990s as a result of the large presence of Latinos in those states. Of course, we have to acknowledge that the Chicano movement of the 1960s was the reason for the increase in enrollment because Chicano activists demanded that Latinas be admitted. The historic HSIs are important because they have historically provided access, but I affectionately call them the TIA HSIs too, first to honor that they are our elders and we should honor them, but also because our tias are sometimes set in their ways and maybe don't want to learn new things or adapt to change. Many of the historic HSIs are the epitome of being Hispanic enrolling because they enroll Latines, but they haven't transformed themselves to truly serve. I've met administrators at these institutions that truly believe they are serving Latinas because they have 50 to 80% of their enrollment who is Latina identified. And because they have high Latina enrollment, and they also have high Latina completion rates. But that is simply a matter of critical mass. So the historic HSIs are often good at getting HSI grants, but not necessarily using them to transform the educational structures for serving Latina students. So we can love the historic HSIs, but also hold them accountable to servingness. We're also going to talk about the historic spaces of servingness. As my graduate students and I develop the next iteration of the servingness framework, we have started to call spaces like cultural centers and ethnic studies and EOP and TRIO programs, quote unquote, historic spaces of servingness. These centers and programs are also the products of the Chicano movement of the 1960s when Chicano activists demanded faculty who looked like them and curriculum that centered their lived experiences. These spaces continue to exist and thrive 50 to 60 years later and are often the only places on campus where true servingness is happening. These historical spaces of servingness were a powerful theme in my dissertation data, which I wrote about in an article called Culturally Relevant Practices That Serve Students at Hispanic Serving Institutions, published in Innovative Higher Education. We have also visited this theme in several episodes of ¿Qué pasa HSIs, including Season 3, Episode 3, when Doctora Arlene Cano Matute and her students taught us about UC Riverside's Chicano student programs. And Season 4, Episode 3, when Alberto Maldonado talked about the Roberto Hernandez Center at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. Today's guests are going to return to the theme of historic HSIs and historical spaces of servingness. I've invited Rosa Isela Cervantes, who is a Nueva Mexicana and a strong advocate for students working in education for 25 plus years. Currently, she serves as director for El Centro de la Raza at the University of New Mexico. Additionally, she is the special advisor to the president on Latino affairs and serves as principal investigator for the high school equivalency program and the college assistant migrant program. She received her master's degree in family studies and her bachelor's degree in sociology and Spanish from the University of New Mexico. She is joined by Julián G. Ángel, who was born and raised in southern New Mexico in the chili capital of the world and is the proud son of Mexican immigrants. Julián is an undergraduate student at the University of New Mexico and a program assistant for HSI Initiatives at El Centro de la Raza. HSI Initiatives was established to advocate for social justice and institutional change at one of the most historic HSIs in the nation. Currently, future Dr. Ángel is a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow, and his research intersects immigration policies and higher education to understand how HSIs serve undocumented students who are excluded from the federal designation. He will be joining our Berkeley School of Education community in fall 2025 as a PhD student in policy, politics, and leadership. And I'm so excited to have him and Rosa here today. So Rosa y Julián, thanks for joining us on Que Pasa HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. But first, we're going to talk about y'all. So let's go ahead and start with your servingness journey. Tell us a little bit about it, and we'll go ahead and bring Rosa to the microphone first.
Gracias. Thank you so much for having us here today. We're really excited to talk with you, first of all. So, my HSI journey started, I would say that it started actually in high school. My first introduction to El Centro, which was then Hispanic Student Services, was in my senior year of high school through a family friend that brought me to meet the then director at the time. And I didn't know that 25 years later, 30 plus years later, I'd be sitting here as director and having seen the program changed really transform in 1994 when I was a student at the time, and we received funding from the legislature here in New Mexico for the first time. And I was a big part of advocating for that funding, not only so that we can get additional staff to help support students, but also just to renovate the space and have a space that was welcoming for students. At that time in 94, El Centro had already existed for 25 years, but it still didn't have resources. It was a director, an admin, and a couple of work study students, which is great at the time. I mean, it was great to have the space and to have that support, but it was not nearly enough what students needed. And so I was very involved as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, and then eventually was able to get a professional staff position here. And I left for a little while to go learn the grant world and do some college prep programming, still at the university, but at a different department. And then about 8 years later, I was able to come back as director. So through all of that time, it's really been this learning experience, navigating through, you know, when I started, the same year I started UNM was when HSIs were developed, right? So in 1992, that was my first freshman semester there that fall. And so this idea of HSI, I've been able to see throughout my time as a student and then later as a staff. But really, I would say in the last 10 years, where it really felt like we ramped up the conversation about what it means to be an HSI, and at UNM to be both an HSI and a Research One institution. So I know that at one point, UNM was one of the first that was both. And I don't think we ever capitalized on that. And so that's been part of my process in learning how we serve students, how at the time I needed to be served. And then as I've moved through that education pipeline, and now as a director, being able to support students and understand what they need now, what is happening in today's world that makes it different for them, and what are the challenges and the barriers that we need to attend to through today, right? And some of them stay the same. And that's what I'm learning also, that we have to stick to the basics, that over time, my needs as an undergrad, while they've changed a little bit, they pretty much have stayed the same for many of our students. Still, things like financial support, emotional support. So growing up in New Mexico, just learning all of those pieces and being able to still be in community, I think that's also why I'm still here, because of that.
Julián, you want to go?
Yes, thank you so much. I want to just give Rosa her flowers. I think she's really a big part of my HSI identity. Coming from rural New Mexico, I really didn't have the access to higher education. So coming to UNM, which is the flagship of the Southwest, was really daunting. But El Centro de la Raza, specifically the college assistant migrant program, helped me a lot, really gave me the financial support to attend higher education, but also just see myself in the classroom. It was my first summer becoming a new student orientation leader where I actually got connected to Rosa. Through that summer, I just kind of learned what it meant to be like a Raza student at UNM. There was a lot more than I thought, like being first generation from rural Mexico. There's a lot of students who have that identity, whether it was like from the north of the state to the south of the state. So I really do think that El Centro allowed us to see ourselves in higher education, but also just be like in co-curriculars, seeing yourself, being a researcher and things like that. So I really do think El Centro has helped me in that sense. And I say Rosa specifically because she was the one that pointed out or like brought to my attention what it meant to be like enrolling versus serving. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy to think that there's like this federal funding that can help us, but because UNM hasn't advanced in certain ways, that isn't something that we can see like in the day. But it was mostly like the services that El Centro had provided is a servingness. It wasn't this HSI designation before. It was like I went to El Centro and they served me. And it was after the fact that I learned that the institution as a whole had that responsibility as well.
Thank you both for that. And I think your stories lead right naturally into the next question I'm going to ask, which is really about learning a little bit more about the state. Y'all are only the second guest to be from the New Mexico area. The first being Melissa Salazar, who runs Escala, right? Which she's not from an institution. She's at Escala, right? Which is an external influence on HSIs. So it's great to have y'all here to talk a little bit more about, right? Like the university setting, right? The HSI setting, but the state in general is unique, right? So go ahead and bring us into that and sort of set the context. I like us to know, like, where are you coming from? What is it like to be in the state you're in to be doing this work? So Rosa, if you can tell us a little bit more about, the demographics of New Mexico and also like the types of Latinas you see in the state and then therefore entering the university.
Absolutely. I think New Mexico is, in my opinion, probably the way the rest of the United States um, is looking or is going to transform into. It's definitely a multilingual, multicultural, very diverse state. There used to be the saying that we were a tricultural state, with the largest populations being Native American, white, and Hispanic. But really, it is multicultural. We have folks from all over here in New Mexico. Multiple languages are spoken. We're still a bilingual dual language state where, again, multiple languages are in the schools. Primarily for the communities that I serve, it's Spanish speaking. And we're seeing that the challenges with that being bilingual in terms of there's not enough resources for our educational pipeline. We're also a poor state when it comes to economics in the sense, but interestingly enough, because we have the labs here, for example, the Los Alamos National Labs, we have the most PhDs per capita in Albuquerque because of our distance to the labs and Sandia Labs and Los Alamos. And so it's an interesting dynamic where we have this kind of large disparity. And then also just beautiful traditions. There's so many things to celebrate here in New Mexico and things that only happen here. For example, our International Balloon Fiesta is one of the biggest and most beautiful times of the year in October. Our celebrations, and I think it's one of the states where you still see the presence of what used to be Mexico in some ways, and very much before that, our indigenous communities. For example, the town that I live in, Bernalillo, it's surrounded by 3, 4 pueblos. And so that little town will probably never grow because of that unless the pueblos do some development. And so it's very unique. Hispanics make up about 45% of the population. We look at Raza and from all backgrounds, primarily of Mexican descent, but we see folks from Puerto Rico, from Cuba, from Venezuela, and so on. And so it is very diverse. Even here at Centro, we did a question for students, and we had students identify in 83 different ways of the students that use El Centro. So that kind of speaks to also the state. And it's changing too. It's constantly changing, both with migration and just the workforce that's here.
Yes. Ooh, 83 ways. That's a lot of intersectionality to think about too, right? Of like I always talk about the complicating of the H, right? The H in HSI is actually complicated, right? Even just getting to servingness is like that's a complicated space. So how many HSIs are in the state?
There is about 23, I believe. I knew you were going to ask me this, and I still didn't look it up specifically, but I believe there was 23. There's still a few that are becoming HSIs. But really, I mean, realistically, HSIs in New Mexico, it's very rare for them not to be an HSI because of the demographics of the state and the college going culture that has been created because of our lottery and opportunity scholarship, where students who graduate from a New Mexico high school and go on to a New Mexico higher education institution can get tuition mostly paid for, almost 100%. And so I think that encourages, especially Hispanic students, to come to college in larger numbers, where otherwise they would have felt like it was inaccessible to them. And so I think, it's the majority of our higher ed institutions are HSIs or emerging HSIs.
Right. Okay. Thanks for laying the context for us. I think it matters a lot, right? The regions matter. And I know New Mexico has such a unique region. So let's learn a little bit more about University of New Mexico, which as an HSI, right? Julián, we're going to bring you in to talk, but I know Rosa, you'll probably chime in as well. But tell us a little bit about some of the steps, and I'll use what you mentioned, Julián, of going from Hispanic enrolling to Hispanic serving or Latina enrolling to Latina serving? What are some of the things y'all are working on? And how is it showing up on campus?
Yes, definitely. I think one of the biggest things that kept our momentum going and has kept our momentum going was we were able to bring Dr. Gina Ann Garcia to our campus, really in an inauguration of what we're trying to do with HSI initiatives. We really do think that UNM as an institution of higher education should be setting a lot of groundwork because we are an HSI state. We should be the leaders because we are the biggest economic contributor to the state. We have so many things like Rosa had mentioned. UNM is such a big economic contributor to the state, like I mentioned, but also just like the people that it serves. There's so many communities in Mexico that we need to elevate and we need to bring to the forefront. And that's what we've been doing for our HSI working group. It's multi-generational, interdisciplinary. We have faculty, we have staff, we have undergrad and graduate students, all in an effort to just, like Rosa mentioned, there's 83 different ways to identify what and how are we going to allow the institution to recognize that we do want to identify as 83 different ways, but also what are the ways or the systems that they have set up to really allow for us to be serving our Latina students. So that's just one thing that we've been doing is our working group. It's more of an El Centro initiative. It hasn't moved past, but I think that is the ultimate goal, right? Is to really have a culturally relevant way to go past this step, is really making it an El Centro initiative and then really bringing our administrative stakeholders to the table to really see what they have to bring to the table as well. Because I think that's a reciprocal process in this work is this is what we think we need to do, or this is how we want to be served. But in the same breath, how do you think you should be serving our students?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question when I think of UNM's time. And so I really feel like right now there's a recognition that we're a Hispanic serving institution. And even the president has in several of she puts out a message every Monday and she has multiple times explained what is an HSI and that UNM is such. But I think the question of serving is where the question comes in, right? What does it really truly mean to be a serving institution? And I think that's where we get caught up. I think right now the commitment is to maintain and support places like El Centro to make sure that we are providing the services to students. But when you think of the population that we have to serve, it doesn't match the funding for our center, for example, and for initiatives like this, doesn't necessarily match the number of students that need the support. So when I looked at the data most recently for UNM, for example, 46% of all students identify as Hispanic. And then just for the entering freshman class, this freshman class now in the fall, it was 54% of students identified as Hispanic. And so that's when you're talking about a school that enrolls about 25,000 students, you're talking over 11,000 students, right, to support. And so I think there needs to be a closing of that gap in terms of the funding there is for students and the amount of students that need to be served and the different ways that departments across campus. So it shouldn't be El Centro that serves Hispanic students only. It really needs to happen across the entire institution. And I think that's where we need to figure those pieces out. How do we ensure that faculty are aware of what's happening? And we're seeing it in pockets. For example, you mentioned Dr. Salazar, and I know they're doing work at UNM Taos, which is one of our branch campuses, where they're bringing in Escala to do the work with faculty to really understand the students we're serving and not expecting our students to fit into our mold, but for faculty to really think about their curriculum and develop curriculum in ways that support students' learning, right? And it's really something that serves all students. And I think this is where the conversation gets a little kind of difficult sometimes, where folks, when we talk about it being a Hispanic serving institution, folks then say, so then you want to leave everybody out. And we're saying, no, when you can serve the largest population well, you're going to learn how to serve all populations well. And so that's the argument for us. So, we had a lot of support from the president's office and the dean of graduate studies to bring you all here, which was great because we hadn't seen that type of support. But again, it had to be spearheaded by El Centro, and we had to be the ones that are pushing this. And right now, with all of the changing conversations at the national level, that puts us in a very precarious space of even knowing what that means moving forward, because we are a very high research institution. that works off of millions of dollars of grants, right? And so depending on where the administration is going with this at the federal level also challenges what that means for us, right? And so there's a lot more conversation to be had there.
Yes, that's such a important conversation right now, right? In the HSI world is like, if there's no more federal grants, what does that mean, right? Does that mean we're not HSIs? And I think it's an important question for y'all because y'all have been successful, right? In federal grants, HSI grants. It's not that you have gotten the HSI grants, right? I know you currently have the NSF HSI hub, right? The intersectionality as inquiry and praxis, race, class, gender, and ethnicity for student success in STEM, right? Led by Dr. Nancy Lopez. You've had grants like that, right? To sort of move this work. But also the conversation in HSI world is grants can't equal servingness, right? And I think it's about to test us because if this federal administration doesn't fund HSIs, you're still enrolling 50%, right? You're still serving that. You're still enrolling that same population. How do you serve beyond the grants, right? And I think that it's about to really hit the road, right? The rubber's going to hit the road as far as who's actually doing that servingness work. So I'm glad y'all have got it moving and doing some of that work. And I know, Rosa, you serve as the special advisor to the president on Latino affairs. Is that like broader than HSI, or does HSI fall under that?
It mostly pertains to the work that we do directly with students. So HSI is a part of that. And actually, the effort to bring you to campus started over a year ago with conversations through our student groups with the president and I meeting with our vice president for Division of Equity and Inclusion, and just thinking through the opportunities as well as the HSRUs. I know we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But so I really just help support the president in understanding student issues specifically, but it should be so much more, right? I don't have the capacity to do more, but I know that faculty and staff need that support as well. And that's one of the questions I got it actually today from one of our biggest college that I went to present to, saying, so can you serve staff and faculty as well? And right now I'm saying, I mean, I can support you individually on some limited things, but not at the capacity that I think a lot of folks would want or need. And I think that needs to happen. But I think that's the case across campus for staff and faculty across different things, right? So I focus my efforts with her specifically around students and what's happening with students, which is why I work closely with Julián and many of our other students around here to understand what are their needs and what's happening so that I can relay that message.
Yes. I mean, obviously the students are the center, but servingness should transfer over to staff and faculty, right? Because faculty and staff feel unserved too. And
Yeah.
like, we're the ones that are serving students. How are we, if we're not being served, how are we supposed to serve students? So
And
I'm
that's
glad
one of
that's
the
coming up.
issues that
Mhm.
has come up with all of the federal things happening right now, that I'm seeing staff and faculty who have mixed family statuses, right? Their families, they may have undocumented folks in their families, or, they just have mixed status. And so they're worried for their family and they're bringing that to campus. And how are we supporting them? Because we want to support the whole person and recognize that, that's one of the challenges, and it's happening in our educational spaces. And so figuring that out is super important.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, so many layers. It's getting more complicated, right? The federal government is making this a lot more complicated. But it's already complicated enough, and we have to, figure this out, right? What HSI and servingness really is. So, Julian, talk to us about the HSI initiative and some of the work you're doing.
Yes, so I get to work with Rosa, essentially just putting like it's research in practice. So it's practice. I think that's like the best part about my job is really just understanding how to relay this to my peers as well. We did a workshop earlier in the semester just to even inform staff like at El Centro, like what is servingness theoretically, but also like what are we doing in practice that is servingness beyond like scholarship that has been put out before. Like servingness is something that we do, but just really putting like a theoretical background into it is just allowing these conversations to go a little bit further to even talk about like colonization and like other oppressive systems that aren't in like the university system. Like there are other things that we need to understand that students experience when they come into these spaces. We need to understand that there are external influences that we can affect But it goes back to what Rosa is saying, that there's a lot of things that we do as Servingness that the university can also help us with as well. But here at HSI Initiatives, we really just wanted to inform us first and then make larger impacts about campus change as well.
I think Julián is being modest also because he's also helping with, along with the committee that we put together, which is made up of Dr. Nancy Lopez, you mentioned, and then some other staff and some of our Centro staff, and then students, both undergrad and grad, in talking about the data that we also received from the day that you visited us. That symposium really was kind of our kickoff to really bringing to light the idea of discussing what it means to be servingness as an HSI here at UNM. Even though we've been in HSI forever, like that's the first time I remember ever having that discussion at that level where you had faculty, staff, community, administrators come together for a day to have this discussion. And so we're actually kind of going through the data now and putting together a set of recommendations that we want to pass on to administration. And Julian's a part of that right now. He was coding our last set of data that we came up with to try to say, okay, what are the 2 or 3 things or 5, 10 that we want to recommend as like actual action items for servingness that we can offer to the rest of the campus.
Right. It's interesting. So like we're talking about this symposium, right? When I visited y'all, but like that was like 6 months ago, right? Like that wasn't that long ago. But this is where the idea of the TIA HSI comes in, right? Like I said it in the intro, right? Like the TIAs that we love, we respect, they're our elders, we honor, but also like you gotta change, right? You gotta get on Facebook, right? Like whatever it is, right? Like you gotta get on social media, right? Like just do some different things, like get up with the times, right? And in the HSI world, that means leaning into these new constructs like servingness, right? It's a newer construct. I mean, the last 5-6 years, right? That wasn't around in 1992 when institutions like University of New Mexico automatically became HSIs, right? Like just by the nature of where they were at, right? Just automatically became HSIs. And so, yeah, I think that it's just so important, right? For us to say that and also to say, if you're out there listening, right, and you're at that kind of campus, like it's never too late, right? Like it's okay to start leaning into this work and acknowledging like, hey, we got to do this, right? There's a national movement going on in the HSI world, right? That it really is a national sort of movement to figure out what servingness is. So
if I could add to that, it's this
mhm,
idea that there's emerging HSIs where they're making being an HSI a part of their mission to become an
yes,
HSI, whereas we automatically, right, because of our demographics and our geography, automatically became an HSI. And so, how do we then transition our mission to include it in a
hmm
way that's meaningful, inclusive, and still allows us to continue to grow as an institution, right? It's really hard to change a mission of a huge institution. And
yes.
I think this is where we start.
Yes, for sure. I love it. I love mission. So I'm glad you're having the conversation. So you did mention the Hispanic Serving Research Universities, the HSRU, right? The Alliance, which I know y'all are a proud member of, right? Your president is very active in HSRU. And that's one of those things that's like, okay, you're where there's pieces going on, right? There are things going on, right, that are happening around the HSI world. So talk to us about the significance, and I think it's connected to the mission piece you just said about being a research institution, right? Your core mission has been to historically to do research, produce knowledge, while also being an HSI, right? What is the significance of that?
Yeah, so basically, the University of New Mexico, along with, I believe it was 20, and now there's 21 institutions who all were designated as both an HSI and a Research One institution, came together to sign an MOU to work together to learn from each other, to share best practices in an effort to accomplish 2 things. One is to increase the number of Hispanic doctoral students by the year 2030, and as well as increase the Hispanic professoriate also by 2030 by a certain percentage. I think those have changed a little bit given new timelines, but really the idea is to think through the pipeline and recognize that while we were working with undergraduate students in large numbers, what kind of supports are we putting towards graduate students and making sure that students like Julian make it through the PhD program, right, and end their journey with with a PhD in hand. And so that's part of the efforts. But then further, I think as we were talking about hiring, part of the challenge was that folks would say, oh, we don't have enough qualified folks of, multicultural backgrounds. And we know that's untrue, but we also recognize how many folks do start. So for example, myself, I'm ABD, right? So how do we get all of those folks like myself who's ABD also through the finish line, but how are we investing in our undergrads to move on to grad school, and how do we make sure that they get through grad school? Because we know that at the graduate level, there's just so much hidden curriculum that many of our students, their first gen to undergrad, there's a lot more support there. And then they go to graduate school, and that becomes even a new experience. And again, another barrier that they have to break and learn through all of the hidden curriculum. So we're doing a little bit of that, and it's really the conversation. What I'm excited about is that the HSRU group here at the university is made up of the provost, the president, the VP for DEI, as well as faculty and staff like myself who sit on the committee to discuss this and try to come up with action items. And so we're in that process of trying to figure out those next steps now and looking at data for graduate students to see what that would mean, what kind of funding would we need to put together, what kind of mentorship programs are required. And so we're having those conversations now. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. We're having those same conversations at UC Berkeley, and we're not even HSI yet, but we are. Yeah, the R part is so important at the University of California in general. The whole UC system is leaning into like, if we're going to be an HSI, we're going to be an HSRI, right? Or as
Right.
the alliance calls HSRU, that matters. It matters a lot, right? We need to lean into our core mission, which for those of us that are at R1s, that's our core mission, right?
Right.
So, but it doesn't mean we can't do that well with our Latine students. So
Right.
I think what,
Sometimes people feel like those are two separate things, but they're
mm,
not, right?
mm-mm.
Doing research and providing inclusive excellence is really about the opportunity for all to be able to become researchers and provide and create new knowledge.
Exactly. And I think one of the, perfect examples that we're having conversation of, and I know y'all have in your campus, is the undergraduate research programs, right? That those could be elevated in this conversation. Like, why aren't we talking about that? Like, how are they going to contribute to our like ability to do really good servingness work with our Latina students? Are our Latina students accessing those, right? There's that's the conversation to be had too, is like, who gets access to those? Those are often privileged spaces, right? Our undergraduate research programs. But Julián, you've been a part of several, including the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship. So talk to us about that and how your research has allowed you to advance ideas of servingness.
Yes, thank you. I think it's very interesting that you talk about like access, first of all. I think that's very important because our Mellon program is through our honors college. And historically, honors colleges are very, you have to have multiple, you are like already established, you have multiple generations, you know what an honors college is, you're more likely to be swung that way. So my experience wasn't like that. My experience was because of El Centro and their research program called El Puente Research Fellowship. I wouldn't even know what Mellon Mays was if it weren't for that connection. It was really to allow students, Raza students specifically, to see themselves in the professoriate. I was blessed to be with three of my peers from El Puente. So that was just really a great pipeline to see that the work, the service that El Centro does transcends to something that's beyond us. Mellon's a nationally recognized foundation. And I think that's really important to offer to Raza students, especially from rural first generation backgrounds. There's a lot of different type of Hispanic identities, Hispanic communities. Some are more affluent than the others. I think really breaking those conversations down as well in New Mexico is really important, making sure that our Raza students are from multiple different, there's a lot of different diversity in Mellon as well, which I really appreciate. Being able to see myself as a scholar, being able to see myself in our faculty coordinator, Dr. Maria Gomez, who's amazing Nueva Mexicana, and just really allows New Mexicans to see themselves in that like professoriate. And I think that's really amazing to see a New Mexican in those roles because that's not something you see all the time. So I think even that in itself is really amazing for it to be New Mexican led as well.
Yes, absolutely. The access piece is huge. That's why I talk about that. And I have a graduate student, doctoral student who's doing her research on high impact practices in HSIs, and that was a big part of the early conversations, right? As she was building her research, was the undergraduate research programs are high impact practices. We know they work, we know they're important, but like who actually gets access to them, right? But for you to say that like you found out about it from El Centro, right? Like that matters too, right? It's like are our spaces of servingness, which we're going to talk about next, right? Those historic spaces connected, right? Highly interconnected with the things like the research programs, undergraduate research faculty are doing research, stuff like that. Like how do we intertwine all of that, right? But yeah, let's talk about El Centro, because you've mentioned it a couple times, even sort of hinting that that is where servingness happens, right? That y'all are the ones that are leading some of this HSI work on campus. Y'all are the ones that hosted the forum, right? That I came to, the open campus forum that a lot of people came to. And I mean, it was created by and for students under the umbrella of the Chicano Studies program to ensure that the university adequately addressed the needs of the largest and fastest growing ethnic population in New Mexico. So tell us about it. Tell us about its historic sort of significance on campus and how y'all have historically been advancing servingness.
I think this is where you're going to hear our bias come in, because both Julian and I have grown up at El Centro, if you will.
It's our house.
It's our home. And so we actually, that's actually what we tell students when we go and we do outreach initiatives, is that we tell students that El Centro is your home away from home, especially for students like Julian, right? He came from about 3 hours south of here, from a really small town, and then coming to UNM, where probably our largest room lecture hall is probably bigger twice over than your high school.
Mm-hmm.
So, right. So just our lecture hall is bigger than the entire high school. And so I think in terms of like the number of people that fit there. And so I think that it's important for students to find a space to connect. And I always tell students, if it's not at El Centro, make sure you find a space on campus and people to connect with, right? Because everybody has different types of needs and wants. And so we have students of all backgrounds that come to El Centro, not just Raza, not just Latine students, because it feels like that for them. It feels like home. And so really our goal is to provide that space of community for students and then advocate for change within the institution. And I think in the last, probably always, definitely to the last director who was a really big mentor of mine, Veronica Mendez Cruz, it's always been about advocating for change for students and making sure that if there's policies out there that are just, they don't really have a purpose, or there's, things, we've always done things this way, so we continue to do things. Well, do they still serve students? And why were they created? Do they have a purpose? Can it be different? Can it be better for students? And I think that's our biggest role, is being able to talk both with the president and with folks across the board. Right now, this semester, we've been doing a lot of work with how to work with and advocate for undocumented students, but really all students from various backgrounds. And so we've talked with faculty, staff, students about the different ways that we can build community, even, right? Being an ally, understanding the differences amongst our students. And so it's really been about all of those things while celebrating who we are as people, right? Whether that's as a Nuevo Mexicana, as a Chicana, as a Latina in my case, in different ways, right? And understanding that our students come with a multitude of intersectionalities. They're not one thing, right? They're not one identity. They have multiple identities. And so that's a little bit about El Centro. And we offer very specific programs, like Julian mentioned, the El Puente Research Fellowship. We have programs for both undergrad and grad students to both explore who they are as individuals and how that connects to their academic journey, and how they can make their academic journey more than what they even thought of or knew about, right? So oftentimes is connecting students, for example, with our Transformar program to other programs like El Puente, where they really learn about research and what does that mean and what could that mean for you. To our graduate students, really demystifying the graduate school curriculum and learning with faculty from across campus on what do you need to do to finish your master's or your PhD or your JD or whatever your end degree is. So a little bit about El Centro, but Julian can tell you more from his perspective.
Oh, yes. I think Rosa touched on everything. It's our home away from home. I will say, just connecting to your book, I think the alum outreach for El Centro is really a big portion. I'm a mechista, so there's machistas that'll be like, oh, I remember El Centro, I remember this. And I think that's really beautiful because they might not recognize UNM or have like a great like thought of UNM, but their mindset on El Centro is that that's their home and they'll never like experience a place like that. And I think that's a really beautiful piece, is really connecting to the alum, really connecting to my peers. A lot of the staff member now went to El Centro too. So it's kind of that reciprocal peer mentorship of like, you can do it too. I was in your shoes like 2 years ago. So like, I think that's really big piece of El Centro, is that peer mentorship across the board is really just a great thing you don't see in many spaces on this campus.
Right. I think the big thing is, how do you elevate that, right? How do you elevate what y'all do, right, to the whole campus? Because a campus like yours comes to, like, probably everybody on campus knows what you do. Everybody on campus touts what you do. Like they talk about you probably, right? They send students to you and then sort of let themselves off the hook, right? And saying like, well, go to a Centro. They do that. Right? They take care of you. They're gonna, that's your home away from home. How do you elevate it, right? How do you make sure that people on campus know that's their job too? Right? It's not just y'all's job, even though y'all do it really well, and we all know y'all do it really well. But how do you elevate it? And I think that's the biggest conversation with these sort of historical spaces of servingness, right, as we're calling them, is that you've been doing it. It's historic. Nobody else has caught on, right, to the kind of things that y'all do, and that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on y'all, right? And
Yeah, but I also think that that's the space that we're in now is really working towards that, because when you get frustrated, so I would get frustrated and be like, oh my gosh, why are they calling us in for something like this? Right? Like everybody should know how to do X, Y, or Z, right? And the reality is that in order to have a true community, then we have to be part of the solution. And I think we're coming to it from that perspective, because I was starting to complain and be like, very much like, well, UNM should just know better.
mm,
Well, I'm a part of UNM, so it's also my responsibility to increase that knowledge and, like you said, elevate the work that we do, and challenge folks to also be that change within their own office.
mm,
And what I really appreciated about the symposium that we had is that we asked specific questions both through your session and the session we had at the very end, where we asked them specifically, so sitting where you sit in your chair, what have you learned today that you can put into motion, right?
mm,
And so it was everything from small things. Like we had a faculty member who said, I go so quickly from class to my office that I just like zoom across campus and I don't think about like looking up. She goes, and I need to recognize that I need to make time to look up and to say hello to people. Of like, I'm a part of campus and I can't just be super hyper
mm,
focused on getting to class or getting to my office, that I also have to participate in the general community, was super helpful. But folks, I think even so, for example, one of my colleagues, she's the director of African American Student Services. And she said, I've been really thinking about what is my role in servingness for
mhm,
Hispanic students and then all students, because of the intersectionalities of our students. And so having folks from different perspectives asking themselves the question of how do I participate, I think starts to elevate the how are we all involved in servingness, as opposed to, oh, that's an El Centro thing or that's a student
mhm.
resource center thing, right? It is actually everybody, regardless of where our position is in the university, for us to step up and challenge ourselves to answer that question.
Exactly. That's the goal, right? Like to get everyone to realize it's their job, right? It is not one office's job. But I think what you say, to validate that, like I hear that a lot in a lot of the historic spaces of servingness, that people just get frustrated. They're like, y'all figure it out. Like, stop relying on it, right? Like, we have done all this heavy lifting and you keep like putting it on us, right? Like, you have to start to do it. And so there's that stage of sort of frustration, right? Of their stages, but you do have to get out of it, right? Because you do, yeah, like you said, there's a tremendous responsibility for y'all on campus to do the good work.
I want to be careful with that, because on the other hand, I don't want to be left off the table at all, right?
Right.
So it's
Yes.
like this balancing act of, yes, bring us in and don't expect us to do it for you, right? We can bring in advice and advocacy, but ultimately we still all have to go to our spaces and do our own work. We can't do it for you. It's even like our mentoring relationship, right? I can give Julián information and I can teach him about different things, but ultimately what he decides to do with that information and how he turns that around and how he acts on it, right? is what matters ultimately. And I think that's the same with this idea of servingness is we can provide support and working with Latinx students and all that we've experienced, both from personal and professional, but for our professional experience. But what are folks going to do with that, right? How are
Mhm.
they going to challenge themselves to meet the needs? And I think that's super important.
Yeah, for sure. I love it. Love to hear it because this is where the conversations need to be. So, Julian, a lot of times on HSIs, students don't necessarily know their campus is an HSI, right? Like, it's just not generally in the vernacular. Most students don't choose to go to a campus because it's an HSI, although I think that might be changing a little bit because campuses are being more forward with it, right? But historically, right, generally students have not always known. But I always talk about the feeling, right? But maybe it feels like an HSI, right? So tell us about your perspective from a student. Like, how have you experienced UNM as an HSI, as a student?
Yes, I think that's really, really important. Being a scholar in HSI, you kind of have to like separate yourself. The first time I heard the concept of HSI was the beginning of my sophomore year, and it's because Rosa had mentioned it. I wouldn't have known anywhere else. It's not in the syllabus. It's not really outlined anywhere. So it was just between Rosa and I, and it was through a mentorship that we had. So it wasn't like I just stumbled upon Rosa and I was like, oh, what's an HSI? It was more so like um, based on the Servingness that El Centro has done, they kind of know what an HSI is and they can elevate that to students. So I think I wanted to point that out is it's like also this mentorship of who knows what an HSI is and how they're providing that to the students. In terms of like a feeling, I think coming from a Hispanic community, I always look towards like a lot of things that call to home, like I don't know. There's so much things. I don't know. I don't want to
The
get into it. The
food.
food, the feeling, the people. I want to say as well. I think just being in spaces and just like talking in Spanish would be like. I think that's just like really comforting too. But it also just makes me think about like why do I feel more comfortable when it's like getting food when it's like not being in a classroom? You know, why am I more comfortable in the sub when like the custodial staff like say hi to me rather than like in a lecture hall. So I think that was also a really big thing of like, why am I relating to people that aren't in my classroom more than I am relating to people that aren't? And so I think being at El Centro and also just telling our peers about this, we've talked about the Dear Colleague letter to some of the staff. And I feel like being myself and like understanding like the implications of it is one thing, but also talking to my peers that don't understand the implications is another thing. It's like this responsibility for me to be like, we are an HSI and these are the things that are happening at a federal level that can affect us is also a really beautiful thing that an HSI should do is pass down the knowledge and the expertise of what is an HSI for the future generations. Because if Rosa hadn't told me, I don't think I could be able to tell my peers what's going on around our campus. So I think that's really important in the mentorship aspect.
Absolutely. So you mentioned food and language. Those are like feelings. I always say that food, language, and music, right? Or like those can create feelings of like the campus is welcoming, right? But then you talked about it being outside of the classroom, right? That the classroom, like it's like we keep those outside. We keep those as co-curricular things, right? Like oh, those happen in other spaces. You come into the classroom, you speak English, right? And that matters too, right? Like that it shouldn't necessarily there shouldn't be those barriers between the spaces right on the campus. But you mentioned language. I mean, y'all, and you had mentioned the state, right? Population is a multilingual population. So how do y'all bring in like language and what I've termed linguistic surveillance, right, into some of this work?
Well, I think it's in multiple ways when we encourage all of our students to really think about their own bilingualism or pursue bilingualism. Ultimately, we have students that both are fluent Spanish and English speakers, some that are in between where, they grew up speaking or listening to Spanish but weren't necessarily encouraged to speak Spanish. We have a very interesting history here in New Mexico where there was several generations that didn't teach their children Spanish because they were punished in schools for speaking Spanish. And so we have this kind of love hate relationship with our language that I think is changing. We have a great heritage language program that's really working to elevate that, where you've heard Spanish all your life, but you didn't speak it. And then we have folks like Julián, who came bilingual. And so we work really hard to employ a fully bilingual staff, at least in Spanish and English, and we really try to have that available so that we can communicate with our students, and also it comes naturally, right? So it's very different if Julian comes and talks with me and I naturally talk in English and Spanish. I'm being more cognizant of it now, being on with the microphone in front of me. But it's one of those things that on my everyday conversation, you can hear us talking in both English and Spanish, and we don't even realize we're doing it, right? And so that's very natural. And so really pushing to make sure that we try to elevate our language abilities across the board. I know we have areas that we have to grow in terms of, we have a lot of our information in both, but like our website, that needs to be, it's bilingual in that we have English and Spanish mixed in there, but it's not fully in one language or the other. And I think we need to elevate some of those pieces. And then just across campus, I know Julian's learning a third language and really elevating that. And I think linguistically, we try to have representation even here in our center so that students, regardless of their level, feel comfortable, right? And so we sometimes get folks to say, oh, I didn't feel comfortable when I first walked to Centro. I only heard English or I only heard Spanish. And so we try to be very cognizant of that and make sure that we're greeting folks and trying to meet them where they're at. So when I find out a student is bilingual, then I work with them on that. And, I greet them in Spanish, or there's oftentimes whole conversations that we have in Spanish and English. It just depends on the student.
Yeah. And thank you for bringing in the reasons why people are not bilingual in our community, right? We've talked about that on Que Pasa HSIs in the past. Dr. Alejandro Gradia really dove into that, right? About like the complexities of that, right? And also how it makes people feel, right? Like across the continuum, right? And that we need to grapple with that at HSIs, and we need to to talk about it, right? We need to be able to talk about that and understand why it is like that, in particular in the United States. And let's not talk about how 47 wants to push for English as the whatever national language, right? We're like, no, bro, like, no, that's not a thing, right? It never has been a thing, and it's not going to be a thing. We really should be a multilingual country, right? Like that would be a much more progressive country than the country that has attacked language for so long, centuries at this point. So yeah, it's complex, right? And we need to acknowledge that in HSIs for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's also part of the servingness, right? Is understanding the complexity of our community. Often folks, when for example, we do our graduation, our stoling ceremony, we will, and I always get caught on this when people read stuff that I write, because I'll put Hispanic, Latine, Chicanx, Nuevo Mexicano. I'll put different terms, and they're like, you should stick to one because you should really just make it. And I push back on that, especially if it's going to be a spoken speech, because I want students to connect with us, and they only connect if we use some of the terms that they identify, right? And so I push back. And so in our website, you don't have one term. We have Raza, we have all of the different terms because we want students to feel comfortable. And that's a complexity that a lot of folks don't have to think of, right? People just put us in this Hispanic box, but the reality of what that means is so complex. And not only that, but you put economic status in there, you put educational level. I mean, you can just start listing all of the differences. We're still all community, but we all connect differently because of our complexity. And so that makes it challenging to talk about because folks, when you think about servingness, they want to do a cookie cutter kind of thing. Let's do one thing, it'll work for all. Well, it doesn't. It's really about learning to meet students and community where they're at.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, this has been a really good conversation. Thank you all so much for joining me today on Que Pasa HSIs. But of course, you got to answer the final question before you get out of the pod. Final question is the name of the show, Que Pasa HSIs. So how do y'all respond to that? So Julián, you go first. I see you smiling ready, huh?
I'm like the most nervous. I would say Que Pasa HSIs is a call to action to really serve students and communities in the greatest capacity so all students thrive.
Yes, perfect. Rosa.
I mean, Julian said it really well. I think for me, Que Pasa HSIs is to remember that we're all gente and we're community, and that we have to remember that at the basics, we're human beings and we should respect and support one another as such.
Hey, perfect, y'all. Thank you so much for joining us today on Que Pasa HSIs.
Thank you for
Thank you
having
so
us.
much.
Gracias.